honored to host Dr. Rita Irvin today. Welcome, Rita.
Oh, thanks for having me, Hasna.
Although you have got so many publications and works, today I have some questions, especially on one of your works titled Toward an Aesthetic of Unfolding in slash Sites through Curriculum. That it was published in 2003, focuses on an aesthetic way of knowing. Let's start out with this question. How does or how may this work contribute to the field of curriculum and education?
So that particular article was written in a time frame when I had spent about 10 years really thinking very deeply about how we could embrace more artistic practices as a form of research and inquiry. And I had done a lot of work with graduate students and others, not only in visual arts, but across the arts, but mostly in the visual arts for myself anyway. And although artography was just, as a word, was just being introduced, this practice of really embracing the arts as a form of inquiry and also as thinking our pedagogical practices as places for inquiry was very important to me. And I wanted to write something myself that I could share with my students as an example of work where you look to aesthetic practices, artistic practices as starting places for thinking about our questions around curriculum pedagogy. And so that particular piece I wrote specifically actually for to use as an example for students. So of course, aesthetic practices are really important to me as an arts educator. It means that we are paying attention to the sensory, to the embodied, to the place of the body, to all of the information that we as humans that we take in, and to pay attention to all of these sensory, aesthetic, all of that information that we take in. It seems interesting to me now to look back at that one because it's almost 20 years ago. And yet at the time, it was so different for the field. At the time, there wasn't, you have to really position it historically because at the time, arts-based research had some traction, but it was really in the narrative inquiry realm.
Yeah.
A little bit in readers' theater, but the visual arts, music, any form of dance and drama, it was really on the fringes. It was, I have to say that many of us at UBC who came from an arts background were a part of the, I think of the of a scholarly community that was trying to push it forward. So historically speaking, that particular article was a deviation from what was available. And so it really showed what was possible, that one could start from the art practice, they could think about the world around them differently, and they could use that as a way to metaphorically, symbolically think about what we do as teachers and learners. So I'm not sure if I really answered your question, but
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your response. But what book has impacted your work as an emerging or established scholar in the field of curriculum? Because this is a question of so many grad students. And better to ask, what messages does this book convey and how can these inform practices and theories in curriculum?
So you shared this with me in advance, so I thought about it a little bit because I've been in the academy now for about 35 years. I didn't actually add up the dates exactly, but I'm taking an estimate here. So I've been in this field for quite a while. And when I was starting my own graduate work, which is quite a while ago now, none of this area that I kind of take for granted now, none of that existed. So what was happening in art education in the 80s, I'll say in the early or late 70s, early 80s, Elliot Eisner was quite a big figure in the field. He'd written a lot in art education. He'd written a lot in curriculum studies, and he was talking about educational criticism and connoisseurship, and that was an interesting idea at the time because it helped us think differently and use the arts and the practices of the arts as a lens, I guess, and how we could look at something beyond the arts, but through an artistic lens. So connoisseurship and criticism were I think central concepts for me in those early years when I was a graduate student. And then as he wrote more about that, there was more and more latitude given to that he and others, one of his students, Tom Barone, Elliot and Tom went on to write more about kind of proposing this idea of arts-based research and arts-based educational research. And it kind of captured my imagination. And especially by the time I took up my position at UBC in the early 90s, I was hoping that we could explore more of that and make it more powerful for visual arts students, especially, but for all art students. So I would say, if I had to, Elliot was prolific. He had several books, but I have written several articles over the years, not recently, but over the years, on a couple of his books. One was The Educational Imagination, and the other was The Creation of Mind. What I would say about Elliot Eisner's work is that he was such a fine writer.
You're right.
And he could speak to scholars and practitioners almost at the same time, I would say, although he did write a lot specifically for teachers in professional magazines. So he wrote for scholarly and professional community. But I think those books were pretty fundamental. And even though my ideas have gone beyond what he posed, I think he opened the door for us, and I'm forever grateful that he did that. So he was very pivotal to some of the early work. Now I have to say, in his early work on arts-based educational research, even though he talked a lot about imagining like different dissertations and the novel, seeing the novel and dissertation, etc., he was still understanding arts-based educational research as pursuing social science methods, but from the data that you collected, that you then interpreted artistically and put it into a form that was artistic. That's different than what I have eventually gone on to write about with artography or in my work. And in fact, that one article that you opened with there is a good example, where the art practice itself is also a part of the research, the art practices themselves are forms of inquiry. And so that's where my work is deviated. And I will say that, I mean, Elliot and I had quite a few conversations on this. And for quite a while, he disagreed with that. He actually really disagreed with it. It had to have that social science base to it. But in time, I mean, around the 2010, when the last arts-based educational research book came out that he and Tom edited, or not edited, sorry, actually wrote. They had both moved to understand that the processes of the arts were also could be also be a form of the research, but that took some time. So I say that his work was very influential to my early thinking, but then I deviated from that, and in fact, that eventually did impact the whole field in that area. I also want to mention, though, and this is not necessarily one book, but I want to mention that William Pinar, was also extremely influential to me. He and Madeline Gourmet, sorry, he and Madeline Gourmet spoke about Carrere.
Yeah.
And Carrere, the whole kind of opening up of that notion of what curriculum is to something that it's more about the process and movement of ideas was very liberating again. So, you take these two ideas and you expand them and fit them into the visual arts and the arts world. And it really just took off. So those ideas were very pivotal to my early years. And that Bill and Madeline, and especially Bill, have written about that in a number of books. In fact, I see one book on your bookshelf there where I'm sure it's written about a lot in understanding curriculum. So those were some of the early ideas that were very influential to me. But notice that they helped me get started. But then we went on, and other ideas percolate alongside them, and they become something a bit different.
Yeah,
that's just the way it is.
I do agree with you that Elliot Eisner left the doors open for us. And I have the same feeling when I'm reading his works. But let's switching gears a little bit, Rita. In terms of personal experience, how has your personal experience shaped your understanding of curriculum and education? Or how has your experience directed your work in curriculum and education?
Oh, I think it's pretty profound. I mean, I was a classroom teacher for 10 years, and at which time I taught mostly elementary, and I was an arts and music specialist. So I taught a lot of classes in several schools, because in those days they had art and music specialists in elementary schools. And as long as I can remember, going back even into my youth, I knew that I wanted to be an arts educator. And so, my whole kind of drive in this world has been about learning as much as I can about the visual arts, about other art forms. Growing up, I played several musical instruments. I wasn't going to pursue that, but in the end, when they needed an art teacher and a music teacher in the same school, I ended up becoming both. And as a result, in the 10 years that I was a teacher, more people knew me as the music teacher than the art teacher, because music teachers are, they're so visible. You see them directing choirs and at concerts, etc., like that. Whereas art teachers are kind of more behind the scenes. So it was interesting to me. But I love that time. I didn't leave teaching because I didn't like teaching. It was more that I just needed to keep learning. I was a person who was a voracious learner, I think. And so even while I was a teacher, I did my master's degree and a diploma. And then at some point I thought, I'm still not really finished. So I went on to do a doctorate. And then, even then, I took a leave of absence, and I thought that I might go back to the schools. And I taught at Lakehead University for 4 years, and during that time, most of that time, my school division, which was Lethbridge School District in Southern Alberta, they let me have a leave of absence, but sooner or later, I had to decide: was I going back or was I staying in the academy? And I decided to stay in the academy. But I mention that because I always really enjoyed teaching. so working with children, with youth, I learned a lot in those years about what's important, how to make it come alive for kids, for communities, because I was also really really wanted to make it strong for students in those communities. I tended to work in schools. I worked in different socioeconomic level schools, and so that was also interesting. I really learned about the value of the arts beyond the school as well. So when I really went on to do my doctoral work, I was very enamored with change. How do we help teachers change? And by the way, the last couple of years I was a teacher. I was also an art consultant in my school district. So I worked with all art specialists or people teaching art, all age levels and grade levels. So I learned a lot there, and I was very, very taken with how do we help people change. And so that was what my doctoral work was on. And so as I think about my career, like at UBC, where I spent 10 years as Associate Dean of Teacher Education, where we established a revised program, really completely restructured what was there. And while I've been at UBC, we've created other programs, graduate level programs, refugee programs, other programs. So I've been really, really interested in I guess changing education to really meet the needs of people, but also trying to understand what do people need in order to make these changes. Although I can't give any definitive learnings here today, what I would say, most people need to be personally involved with it and see meaningful change for themselves. And when they see meaning for themselves, then they'll change it for themselves and others. And so I'm a great believer that people need to be doing the work.
You're right, yeah.
Be involved in the work. And so it is not about being told something, but it's about actually being involved in it.
And put it into practice, yeah.
And it's a ramble.
Yeah. How local and contextual issues and possibilities constrain or enable your work as a scholar in curriculum and education? How are these compared to issues in other locations?
So that's a pretty big question. I mean, when I think about it, I'm not sure I really understand your question, but let me give you a couple examples. So when I was Associate Dean of Teacher Ed, it was very obvious in all of the discussions that we could only do so much in a teacher ed program. And then it was really what happened for the emerging teachers, the new teachers, what happened in those early years as they entered the profession. Yeah. And so alongside the development of a new program, we also created a mentoring program for the province of British Columbia. Now, I did this in conjunction with large groups like the BCTF, school superintendents, principals, vice principals, associations.
Yeah.
I say that very specifically as a faculty of education that was really committed to the profession of helping teachers, helping people become teachers, but how do we help them when they actually enter the profession? So that was a big, taking that on and understanding that we could actually work together and create something. And I was quite proud of that. That mentorship program, it gradually got bigger and bigger. It started small and it gradually got bigger as we learned more. And so that was one where you kind of read the context, you see the needs of the profession, and you try and develop things that are going to make sense for the group. Another instance I can give you is I won't go into the long story, but my head of department, my current head of department is from Kenya, and there were other people that he knew that came to us and actually asked us if we could help them with at that time the largest refugee camp in the world, which was in northeastern Kenya called Dadaab. And it was mostly refugees from Somalia, Sudan, but mostly Somalia. And so again, it's a big story, and I'll just summarize. So as a consortium of universities, there was a number of us who worked on providing elementary and secondary teacher education programs and also other higher education programs. This was funded by the Canadian government, and we did that for about, I think it's about 8 years in total.
Yeah.
And these are opportunities where we come together, we recognize an extreme need, extreme social justice need. Here are people who are just so hungry to learn and to try and do something for this community that's in such an extreme space. And even if they return to their country or go to a different country, what do they have to offer? So this program was meant to try and help them as they navigated the world. So that was another program I was very, very proud of. But there's been lots of projects I've done over the years with small groups, medium-sized groups, and then these last two I mentioned were very large. But you take into context the needs of the community, what it is what strengths you can offer, and then I think with bringing groups of people together, you negotiate what's possible, and you keep working at it, and something will happen there. Not everything keeps surviving. Both of those projects I just mentioned, at some point, the original funder was not able to continue funding it, and alternate funding was not found, and so both of those projects ultimately ended.
Yeah.
But I feel good about it in the sense that for a period of time, there was quite a large number of people that was helped. So that's some of the pluses and minuses there. We are always at the so much of this requires funding, and we're not always able to get the funding that we need for the projects that we envision. So
yeah, as you talked about different projects that you've done so far, it could be a question of so many scholars, maybe as well as graduate students. Grad student, in the field of curriculum, that what issues relating to curriculum and education would you like to do more research on?
That I would like to do more research on? Maybe it's because I'm getting close to retirement, but I'm more, and I've done so many big things. I'm kind of going back to, so what's most important? And maybe it's the pandemic that's done a little bit of this too. Like, what is it that individuals need? And right now I think of my own grad students or my friends or my family. And it comes back to those, what's meaningful for the individual and how can the individual navigate these challenges? And so for me, it's about taking care of the individuals. I think social, emotional, physical, and artistic, and probably spiritual needs as well. And you know what? When I think about that, the arts offer a lot. And I think when it comes, the bottom line is to return to an arts practice. I think what happens so often in our world is, even for arts educators, I've seen this time and time again, and it's certainly even for myself, where we can get so committed or embroiled in work, other kinds of work that we disregard or set aside or forget our own art practice. So what I'm spending my time doing now is, I think, trying to remind people that we need this. So, for instance, in some of what I'm working with my own PhD students now is a walking practice.
Yeah.
I'm encouraging people to find their own practices, artistic practice at home, whatever that is. Coming together, sharing a bit of that with one another. And then alongside that, reading and thinking about some of the literature we have, and then sharing that with others in such a way that people take up their own inquiries. I think if people can just take up their own arts-based inquiries in their personal lives, it'll have a big impact on their own experiences. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but I think the arts offer a lot to curriculum and pedagogy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, such thoughtful and amazing responses, Rita. And thank you so much for accepting JCAC's interview invitation. Stay safe.
Oh, you're very welcome.